Life has a way of testing us in the smallest moments. Sometimes the true weight of who we are is not revealed on a battlefield or in the spotlight, but in the quiet aisles of a grocery store when no one is supposed to be watching. Yet in today's world, even kindness can be twisted. Even compassion can be ridiculed. That's the danger of living under the gaze of viral judgment. The crowd cheers for spectacle, not truth. But once in a while, fate steps in and flips the script. A simple gesture of humanity, misunderstood and mocked, can suddenly expose a deeper story hidden in plain sight. A story of sacrifice, of promises kept, and of what it really means to stand for others when it matters most. Today, you're about to hear the journey of a man who never asked to be remembered, yet whose choices remind us that even when the world jeers, kindness is never wasted. His corner store became a stage. His small act became a storm, and the truth that followed silenced an entire neighborhood. Stay with me until the end, because this isn't just about one man. It's about all of us, about what we choose to honor, and about what happens when compassion refuses to bow to cynicism. If this story moves you, don't forget to follow along, hit like, and share your thoughts in the comments. I promise you'll carry its lesson long after the last word is spoken. The fluorescent lights inside Michael's grocery store hummed with a weary buzz, the kind of sound that belonged to a place older than most of the people shopping there. The floor tiles bore faint scuffs from years of footsteps, and the air smelled faintly of citrus cleaner mixed with the earthy scent of produce stacked neatly in bins. It was late afternoon, the lull between school dismissal and dinner, when the store often filled with hurried parents and tired workers. At the counter, a young mother stood stiffly, her hand wrapped around a crumpled handful of bills and coins. Two children clung to her sides, one tugging at her sleeve, the other balancing on tiptoes to peek at a row of candy bars by the register. Their clothes were neat but worn thin, and the weight of embarrassment already bent her shoulders as she set her groceries down. Bread, rice, a carton of eggs, a small bag of apples, and a gallon of milk. Michael scanned the items, his large, work-roughened hands moving steadily. He had run this little store for nearly 2 decades, and though his hair had grayed early, his eyes still carried the sharpness of someone who noticed everything. The total rang up, $24.63. The woman's lips pressed tight as she unfolded her bills. She counted quickly, then counted again, her cheeks flushing. $18.75. That was all she had. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pushed the money toward him. I don't have enough, she whispered, her voice low as though saying it quietly might soften the shame. Maybe you can put the fruit back. Just the apples. We don't need those. Her son's face fell instantly, but he said nothing. Michael looked at her, then at the children, then at the apples resting on the counter. He didn't hesitate. Without a word, he slid the apples back into the bag. He added the milk and, with a small motion so natural it almost went unnoticed, reached behind him and placed a packet of cookies in the sack as well. That'll be fine, he said simply, his tone final. Take these home. The woman's eyes widened, confusion warring with relief. But I can't. It's done, Michael interrupted gently. He tapped the bag once, the way a father might pat a child's shoulder. No one should be hungry tonight. Behind them, a man in line scoffed loudly, the kind of sound meant to draw attention. He was middle-aged, dressed in a polo shirt tucked into crisp jeans, his phone already in his hand. Unbelievable, the man muttered, his voice pitched just high enough for everyone nearby to hear. Handouts again. This is why people never learn. Michael didn't look at him. He was too practiced at ignoring voices like that. He lifted the bag over the counter, placing it carefully into the mother's arms. Her hands shook as she took it, her lips forming a trembling, "Thank you," she barely managed to say aloud. The children looked at him as though he had just handed them treasure. She turned quickly, ushering the kids out before her gratitude betrayed how deep her need really was. The bell above the door jingled, and then they were gone. The man in line smirked, his phone angled toward Michael. "Smile for the internet," he said in a cutting tone. "People should see how businesses are being run into the ground." Michael's eyes flickered briefly to the camera, then back to his counter. He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled a rag from beneath the register and began wiping the surface with steady, methodical strokes. Silence was his answer. What no one noticed, not even the man with the phone, was the small metal framed on the wall behind him. Its ribbon had faded, its silver dulled by time, but the shine was still unmistakable. A second identical metal sat tucked deep inside the front pocket of his flannel shirt. Sometimes, when he felt the world pressing too hard, he rested his hand over it, as though its weight alone could steady him. He did so now, briefly, before returning to his quiet work. The man with the phone tapped furiously at the screen, uploading the video with a caption dripping in disdain. "Local shopkeeper rewards freeloaders. This is why society is broken." Michael didn't know it yet, but that one clip, that one moment of compassion twisted into insult, was about to turn his small store into a battleground between judgment and truth. For now, the only sound was the soft hum of the lights and the faint bell on the door swinging shut. Michael stacked a few cans near the counter, his expression unreadable, as though he had simply done nothing more than stock another shelf. But deep inside, he felt the old ache stir, the one he thought he'd buried years ago. The weight of memory pressed on his chest, the echo of nights long past when choices had meant life or death. He had kept his code then. He kept it still. Outside, the evening shadows lengthened across the cracked pavement of the neighborhood street. A mother held her children closer as they walked home with food they hadn't expected to have, and a man's smirk followed them online, where strangers would soon decide who was right and who was wrong. Michael stayed at his counter, silent as always, carrying both the burden of scorn and the quiet strength of a truth no one yet knew. The storm had only just begun. By dawn the following morning, Michael's corner store no longer felt like his own. The same cracked pavement, the same dusty shelves, the same stubborn hum of fluorescent lights. But there was a different energy in the air, sharp and cold like the edge of broken glass. He noticed it the moment he unlocked the front door. The street outside was not just quiet, it was watchful. The video had traveled faster than wildfire. What had begun as a single clip with a bitter caption now spread across countless feeds. By the time Michael switched on his old desktop computer in the back office, his store's name had been tagged in posts he'd never seen before. People were sharing their opinions without ever stepping foot in his shop. Words like enabler, soft-hearted fool, and destroying discipline were repeated again and again. For every kind stranger who wrote "bless him" or "the world needs more people like this," there were 10 more eager to tear him down. He didn't linger on the screen. He had never been a man to chase approval, still the sting was undeniable. When you build a life of service, no matter how small, to be painted as the opposite of what you are feels like having your name carved wrong in a stone. The bell above the door jingled just before 7. A familiar figure stepped in. An older woman with a shopping basket she'd carried for years. She had once been among his most loyal customers, always chatting about her grandchildren while she picked out vegetables. This morning, her steps faltered at the threshold. She glanced at him, at the shelves, at the floor, and then, with a strained smile, mumbled something about forgetting her wallet and turned back out without buying a thing. Michael said nothing. He simply returned to stacking canned beans into neat rows. An hour later, another customer entered, a young man who usually came for cigarettes and a lottery ticket. Today, his eyes flicked around nervously. He set his items down but hesitated before pulling out his card. "You know," the young man said, shifting his weight, "people are talking. They say you're, giving away stock. You're going to make it hard for the rest of us if you keep letting folks take advantage." Michael met his gaze briefly, then finished ringing up the purchase. "The price is the same as always," he replied evenly, sliding the receipt across the counter. The man shrugged, grabbed his bag, and left without another word. Word had spread through the neighborhood like rot through wood. Even those who had known him for years began to keep their distance. A group of teenagers who often lingered outside for sodas now laughed as they passed, tossing out comments about Mr. Charity Case and the welfare store. The wound deepened when a fellow shopkeeper, a man named Davis who ran a hardware store 3 blocks down, came by during lunch. Davis had been a business acquaintance for over a decade, always good for a handshake and a shared laugh about city inspectors. Today his tone was clipped. "Mike, listen," Davis began, leaning on the counter, his voice low but edged. You've got to stop this bleeding heart nonsense. Times are tough for all of us. Customers see you giving things away. They'll start expecting it everywhere. You'll ruin the market for the rest of us. Be smart. Michael wiped his hands on a rag, his face unreadable. Doing what's right isn't ruining anything, he said. It's the only thing that matters. Davis exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Suit yourself. Don't come asking for help when you're out of business. He left, the door swinging closed with a thud that echoed louder than usual. That evening, the delivery truck pulled up later than normal. The driver, an old Navy man named Clark, had shared more than a few war stories with Michael during late drop-offs. But today, Clark seemed uneasy as he slid out of the cab. Corporate's been sniffing around, he said, avoiding Michael's eyes as they unloaded boxes together. They don't like bad press. They told me to cut back your order, at least for now. Image, you understand. Michael nodded once. No anger, no protest. He could tell Clark felt the stunning of it as well. For a moment, the older man hesitated, his gaze catching on the faint glint of the metal pinned discreetly on the wall inside the store. He had noticed it before, though never asked. Today he cleared his throat and said softly, I know you've done more than most will ever understand. Don't let these fools break you. The words lingered, but the night pressed heavier still. When the last customer had left and the street outside had dimmed into shadow, Michael locked the door and walked slowly back to his small apartment above the laundromat. The smell of detergent and dryer heat wafted up the stairwell. His body ached with fatigue, but his mind carried a sharper weight. He sat at the small wooden table by his window and pulled a notepad close. The pen in his hand moved slowly, deliberately, forming each letter with care. He wrote a note on lined paper, the kind meant to be taped to a door. To my neighbors, if my actions have caused discomfort, know that my intention has only been to treat every person with dignity. We all face burdens unseen. My shop will remain open to all, and I will continue to serve as best I can. Michael. He placed the pen down and stared at the words. They were simple, but they carried the weight of his entire life's code. Later, lying in bed, he reached for the metal he kept tucked in his shirt pocket. His fingers brushed the cool metal, tracing the grooves worn smooth by time. His mind drifted far from the laundromat hum, back to a desert half a world away, where heat shimmered on broken concrete and the night sky was cut with gunfire. He remembered the sound of men crying out, the smell of blood and sand, the steady rhythm of his own heart as he pressed bandages with hands that refused to shake. He remembered the vow he had made, not to medals, not to glory, but to people, to never turn away when someone was in need. Now, in a city that measured worth in likes and shares, that vow was being tested in a different way. No bullets, no explosions, just words sharp enough to wound. Michael closed his eyes, his hand still resting over the metal. He whispered nothing into the dark, but the silence carried his answer. No matter what they said, no matter how many turned their backs, he would not break his code. The night stretched long, the quiet broken only by the occasional rumble of the dryers below. The city outside kept scrolling, kept judging, kept moving. And Michael lay still, waiting for whatever storm tomorrow would bring. The following dawn broke strangely quiet, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Michael rose at the same hour he always did, his body still moving with the discipline of old habits. He brewed coffee in the dented pot that had sat on his counter for years, then descended the creaking stairs to the store. His joints ached faintly, but he pushed through, unlocking the door with a soft clink of keys. The first sound that broke the silence was not the bell above his shop door, nor the hum of early customers. It was the low, steady growl of engines. One truck, then another, then more. The noise deepened, filling the narrow street until windows rattled and pigeons scattered from the eaves. Michael stepped outside, a rag still in his hand. Across the cracked asphalt, massive military transports rolled in and came to a halt. The morning air shivered with the sudden stillness that followed. Heavy tires pressing into the ground like immovable anchors. The vehicles stretched down the block, their olive-drab paint catching the new light. Doors swung open and soldiers poured out in crisp uniforms. They moved with precision, forming lines, their boots striking the pavement in unison. Neighbors who had once averted their eyes now rushed to their windows, pulling curtains aside, phones already lifted to capture whatever spectacle was unfolding. The same mouths that had whispered and sneered the day before now buzzed with speculation. "What's going on?" a voice called from a balcony. "They're here for him," another answered. Children pressed faces against railings, their wide eyes reflecting both fear and excitement. A rumor spread in seconds, something about raids, debts, hidden crimes. In a world fed on gossip, truth was the last thing anyone considered first. Michael stood in the doorway of his store, unmoving. His hands, steady as ever, folded behind his back. His face gave nothing away. But inside, a current stirred, an old recognition, the sound of boots on pavement echoing through his memory. And then she appeared. The young mother from 2 days earlier stepped from the crowd of soldiers. Her hair was tucked neatly beneath a cap, her uniform pressed, her bearing transformed. The children who had clung shyly to her before were now cleaned, dressed, standing straighter than their small frames seemed capable of. Beside her walked a man in his late 20s, his shoulders broad beneath a dress uniform heavy with medals. His stride carried the practiced weight of someone who had marched in deserts and jungles, who had heard the sound of both silence and fire. They stopped in front of Michael's store. The mother looked up at him, her eyes no longer filled with shame, but with something fierce, something proud. "Sir," she said, her voice clear enough to carry across the hushed street. Michael inclined his head slightly, but did not speak. The murmurs swelled. Neighbors leaned farther out of windows, the recording lenses of dozens of phones now fixed on him. This was no raid. This was something else entirely, though none yet understood. Then the general arrived. The crowd shifted as a vehicle door opened and a man stepped out, his presence commanding silence without a word. A 3-star general, his uniform immaculate, medals and ribbons gleaming beneath the morning sun. He walked with the calm authority of someone accustomed to storms. The soldiers saluted sharply as he passed. The general returned the gesture briefly before directing his attention to Michael. Michael did not move. He stood in the threshold of his store, his frame steady, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, the two men simply regarded one another across the space of cracked pavement and years of unspoken history. Then, with a voice that carried the weight of ceremony and memory, the general spoke. "Sergeant Michael Bennett," he said. The name rang out like a stone dropped into still water. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The general had not addressed him as shopkeeper, nor Mr., but by rank, by a name the neighborhood had never known. Michael's jaw tightened, but his eyes never wavered. The general stepped closer, his polished shoes crunching lightly against the grit of the street. "It has been too long." The murmurs among the neighbors grew louder now. Someone whispered, "Sergeant, he was military." Another hissed, "What's happening?" Phones recorded every breath, every glance. Michael finally moved. He shifted his weight slightly forward, his voice low but steady, carrying just enough for those closest to hear. "Sir," he said, acknowledging the general with the respect that came from long-ingrained reflex. The simple words seemed to seal something unspoken between them. The general studied him with eyes sharpened by decades of command. "You thought you could disappear," he said, not unkindly, "but some debts cannot be forgotten." The crowd leaned in, hungry for explanation. Behind the general, the soldiers stood at attention, their faces impassive. But the young mother and her husband, both soldiers themselves, looked at Michael with expressions that burned with gratitude, reverence even. The street held its breath. Michael did not answer. He had never been a man who sought stories or recognition. But in that moment, with an entire block watching, the silence itself became its own kind of admission. For years he had lived quietly, a man known only as the stoic owner of a struggling corner store. But now the past was pressing in, demanding to be seen. The general turned slightly, addressing the soldiers first, then the crowd. "Many of you do not know who stands among you. You see only a grocer, a quiet man behind a counter. But I know him by another truth. He is a man who once stood where few could have survived, and whose actions gave men like me a life we did not deserve to keep." Gasps, murmurs, shifting feet. The narrative was tilting, breaking apart before their eyes. Michael's hand brushed the inside of his flannel shirt, where the familiar metal rested, warm from his body's heat. The gesture was small, almost invisible, but for him it was the tightening of a thread that connected his past to this very instant. The general's gaze never left him. The silence stretched taut, waiting for the story to be spoken aloud. And then finally the general lifted his chin, his voice steady and resonant. This man is no ordinary shopkeeper. He is the medic who saved lives at Mogadishu. The words hung in the air, a revelation detonating like a shell in the center of the street. Neighbors gasped, phones trembled in hands, whispers turned into sharp intakes of breath. The man they had judged, mocked, and abandoned was suddenly revealed to be something else entirely. A survivor, a protector, a soldier who had once carried men through hell. Michael remained still, his expression unchanged. He had not asked for this unveiling, but it had come whether he wanted it or not. And the street, caught between shame and awe, waited for the rest of the truth. The general's declaration settled over the street like a sudden shift in weather. Conversations that had hummed with judgment days earlier now collapsed into stunned silence. Neighbors who had filmed eagerly now held their phones lower, as though their devices had become too heavy. Michael stood still at the threshold of his store, the dawn light catching in the lines etched deep into his face. He looked unchanged, yet the air around him had altered entirely. The children who had once eyed him with suspicion now clung tighter to their parents' legs, staring at him as though he were no longer just the man behind the counter. The young mother stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "I saw it," she said, "the medal on the wall. At first I thought it was just decoration, but then I looked closer. I knew the ribbon. My husband knew the name. It couldn't be coincidence." Her words spilled into the space, filling the gap between the general's revelation and the crowd's disbelief. Her husband, the ranger in dress blues, nodded firmly. His jaw tightened as he spoke. "Michael Bennett, they used to tell stories about you in training. A medic who refused to leave the wounded, who stayed in the hot zone when everyone else thought it was over. They said you were the reason men walked out alive who should have been buried there." Michael's gaze flickered briefly toward him, but he said nothing. The general raised his hand, silencing the murmurs that had begun to swell again. His voice carried the weight of command, but also something softer, something personal. "It was October 1993, he began. Mogadishu. The city was tearing itself apart, and we were caught in the middle. What was supposed to be a short mission stretched into chaos. Gunfire, smoke, the night sky broken by tracer rounds. We lost good men that day, too many. But there are 7 of us who live because of him." He turned then, gesturing toward Michael. The general's eyes, usually cold steel, burned with something raw. "I was one of them." The statement struck harder than the first revelation. The neighborhood seemed to stop breathing altogether. The general continued, his words slow, deliberate, as though he were walking back into memory step by step. "I was bleeding out, shrapnel in my side. They told him to fall back, to save himself. Orders were given, but he disobeyed. He stayed. 16 hours under fire, he moved from one man to another, stitching, bandaging, forcing us to live when we had already given up. He carried me on his back when my legs refused. He dragged others through broken streets. And when dawn came, he was still standing." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some neighbors shook their heads in disbelief. Others pressed hands to their mouths, shame beginning to color their cheeks. The general's voice deepened. For that, he received the Silver Star. But when the war ended, he chose silence. He walked away. No interviews, no speeches, no politics. He opened a store and lived like the rest of you without ever revealing who he was. Until now. Michael shifted slightly, his hand brushing against the pocket where the second medal rested. His face betrayed nothing, but his shoulders bore the quiet weight of memories too heavy for words. The general stepped closer, lowering his tone now, speaking not just to the soldiers but to every soul in earshot. "You judged him for kindness. You mocked on him for compassion. But you do not understand, this man's compassion is not weakness. It is the very reason men like me still breathe." The silence that followed was thick, heavy, nearly unbearable. Then, slowly, a single sound broke it. The ranger, the young husband standing beside his wife, straightened, heels clicking together. He lifted his hand to his brow in a sharp, precise salute. His eyes did not leave Michael's. One by one, the soldiers behind him followed. Dozens of arms rose, palms rigid, a forest of salutes aimed not at the general, but at the shopkeeper who had once been their lifeline. Michael's chest rose and fell once, deep and steady. For a moment, his eyes closed. Then he raised his own hand, the motion fluid, practiced, etched into muscle memory that had never left him. The salute held, unwavering, until the general lowered his own hand in acknowledgement. The neighbors, still clutching phones, found themselves unable to record. Many lowered their devices, shame burning hot against their skin. A few wiped their eyes. Children whispered questions their parents could not answer. The man who had once muttered about handouts stood stiff at the back of the crowd, his face pale. The words he had spat so confidently only days earlier now felt poisonous in his own mouth. He looked down, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The general turned once more, addressing not Michael this time, but the community itself. You wanted to judge him for giving away apples and milk. But I tell you this, he gave away far more once. He gave blood, bone, years of his life. He gave everything so men could see their families again. And he asks for nothing in return. The truth weighed heavy, undeniable. The narrative spun online. The outrage that had fueled the neighborhood's scorn was unraveling before their eyes. Michael lowered his hand slowly, his salute ending as quietly as it began. He did not smile, did not bask in the recognition. He simply returned to stillness, as though the moment belonged not to him, but to those who had been lost. The young mother's children stared up at him, awe shining in their eyes. The boy who had once been disappointed about losing apples now clutched the bag of groceries tighter, understanding something deeper than food had been given. Around them, the block that had been ready to condemn now stood humbled, silenced by a truth too profound to ignore. Michael, for his part, seemed almost untouched by the spectacle. His hand brushed once more against the metal hidden in his pocket, grounding him, reminding him that his code was not for applause, not for recognition. It was for the quiet promise he had made long ago, to never turn away when someone needed him. The general's words still hung in the air, echoing down the narrow street. Some debts could never be repaid, and some men, no matter how deeply they tried to disappear, could never be forgotten. The salute ended. The soldiers lowered their hands in unison, the sound of boots shifting against pavement, the only noise. The neighborhood exhaled at last, and Michael, silent as ever, returned his gaze to the crowd, not with pride, not with anger, but with the same calm steadiness that he had shown when sliding a bag of groceries across the counter. The truth was out now. There was nothing more to say. The soldiers' salute lingered in the air long after their arms dropped. The street had fallen silent, the weight of revelation pressing down on every face, on every whispered judgment that had been thrown like stones only days before. The neighborhood that had turned its back on Michael now found itself staring at a truth it had not earned but could no longer deny. For a moment, no one moved. The hush was broken only by the distant bark of a bomb and the faint rustle of wind through the trees. Then slowly the tide began to shift. It started with the smallest of gestures. A little girl no older than 8 stepped shyly from the crowd, clutching a piece of paper folded in half. Her hair was in uneven braids, her shoes worn down at the soles, but her eyes were steady as she approached the store. She held the paper out with both hands, her voice trembling. "I drew this for you," she said. Michael took it carefully, unfolding it to reveal a crayon drawing of a soldier with a medal pinned to his chest. Beneath the figure were the words, shaky but determined, "Thank you for being brave." He looked at the child, his expression softening just enough for her to catch it. He gave a small nod. She beamed, retreating quickly back to her mother, who dabbed at her eyes with the edge of her sleeve. The spell broke. One by one, neighbors who had once avoided his store now edged forward. A man in his 60s pulled a photograph from his wallet, an old, creased snapshot of himself in uniform decades earlier. "I didn't know," he murmured, his voice thick. "Should have guessed. Only someone who's seen it would look like you do when it's quiet." Another neighbor, a woman who lived 2 doors down and had previously crossed the street to avoid him, approached carrying a warm plate wrapped in foil. The scent of spiced meat and pastry filled the air. She set it gently on the counter. These are empanadas. My grandmother used to say food speaks better than words. I'm sorry for judging. Michael accepted the plate without flourish, setting it beside the register. Thank you, he said simply. The floodgates opened. People came not with excuses, but with offerings. Flowers clipped hastily from gardens. Handshakes given with eyes lowered in shame. Small tokens pressed into his hands. Coins, notes, even a single chocolate bar, wrapped with a child's ribbon. Each gesture was a fragment of apology, an acknowledgement that the story they had written about him was wrong. A murmur passed through the crowd as a van pulled up, cameras glinting in the morning light. A local news crew stepped out, adjusting tripods, wires, and bright microphones. They moved quickly, the scent of opportunity thick on them. Mr. Bennett, one of them called, the words sharp and eager. Can we get a statement? How does it feel to be recognized? What do you want people to know about your service? Michael shook his head. This isn't about me, he said firmly. It never was. Talk to her. He gestured toward the young mother still standing tall in her uniform, her children clutching her hands. Talk to any family who sacrifices every day without applause. I'm just a man running a store. The reporters looked dissatisfied, but his refusal was final. They turned reluctantly to capture sound bites from the crowd instead. Amid the noise, a figure lingered at the back. It was the businessman who had first filmed the checkout days earlier, the one whose disdain had sparked the online storm. He looked thinner somehow, weighed down by the shame in his own posture. He held a paper cup of coffee in his hand, steam curling upward. Slowly, hesitantly, he approached. He set the cup down on Michael's counter. Black, I remembered, he said softly. He didn't meet Michael's eyes. I shouldn't have done what I did. I wanted attention, wanted to feel clever. But all I did was hurt someone better than me. His voice cracked on the last word. I'm sorry. The words hung awkwardly between them. Michael studied him for a moment, then nodded once. Apology noted, he said evenly. He lifted the coffee and took a sip, the gesture both acceptance and dismissal. The businessman exhaled, shoulders sagging with a relief that bordered on collapse. Not far away, the original video uploader, now infamous even within his own circles, stood with his phone still in his pocket. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by a look of quiet devastation. In front of everyone, he unlocked his screen, pulled up the post, and hit delete. He turned the phone toward the crowd, showing the vanished video as though erasing it could erase the damage done. I was wrong, Guillermo, he admitted, his voice raw. I was so wrong. The crowd, which had once egged him on, now turned their attention away. They were done feeding the cruelty that had nearly broken their community's dignity. Inside the store, the atmosphere began to change. Children laughed softly again, tugging at candy displays. Adults whispered, not with scorn, but with respect. It was not commerce yet, but connection, a fragile hum of humanity that had been missing for too long. Michael moved among them quietly, stocking shelves, ringing up small purchases, receiving thanks without embellishment. His smile was faint but present now, a flicker of warmth breaking through the years of stern reserve. He allowed himself that much. The medal, once tucked away in his pocket, now sat openly on the counter beside the register. He did not flaunt it, did not lift it for the cameras, but he no longer hid it either. It was not a trophy, it was a reminder. As the day stretched on, the store filled with the sounds it had known before. Bells chiming, doors swinging open and closed, voices rising and falling. Yet beneath it all was something new. Respect, gratitude, a quiet understanding that the man behind the counter was more than they had ever believed. Toward evening, as the sun slanted low and painted the buildings gold, Michael stepped outside to find the street alive again. Children played on the sidewalks, laughter chasing down the block. Adults spoke in softer tones, nodding at him when their eyes met. The hostility that had once choked the air had loosened, replaced with something fragile but real. Reverence. At one point, he caught sight of Davis, the hardware store owner who had warned him about bleeding heart nonsense. Davis approached slowly, hands shoved into his pockets, his face flushed. He stopped a few feet away, cleared his throat, and muttered, Guess I had it backward. You're the only one here who's been running his business right all along." Michael offered no sharp reply, only a steady nod. "It's never about the shelves," he said. "It's about the people who walk through the door." The words seemed to strike deeper than Davis expected. He nodded quickly, retreating without another word. As dusk fell, lanterns flickered on along the block, and the air filled with the warmth of shared meals drifting from open windows. The community had begun to heal itself piece by piece around the man they had nearly cast out. And Michael, standing once more behind his counter, allowed himself a quiet breath of peace. For the first time in years, he smiled. Not wide, not boastful, but real. The store, his little corner of the world, was alive again. Not because of profit, not because of publicity, but because the truth had been seen. And in that truth, the neighborhood remembered itself. The days that followed felt different on the block. The sharp edges of suspicion and ridicule had dulled, replaced by the steady hum of life trying to mend itself. Customers came not only for groceries, but for the unspoken comfort of standing in Michael's store, breathing the same air as the man they now understood had carried far heavier burdens than any of them could imagine. But for Michael, the rhythm of his life remained much the same. He opened his store at dawn, stocked the shelves, swept the floors, and rang up purchases with the same measured patience. If anything, he seemed even quieter, as though the noise of recognition was something he would allow to swirl around him, but never absorb into himself. Then, on a cool morning just a week after the soldiers had come, the general returned. This time he arrived not with convoys or lines of uniformed men, but with a single car and a solemn expression. He stepped out, carrying a carefully folded flag cradled in his arms as if it were made of glass. The crowd that had begun to gather each morning in front of Michael's store fell into silence as the general approached. Conversations ceased, children stopped fidgeting, and even the usual city clamor seemed to hold itself back. Michael looked up from the counter where he had been arranging a row of oranges. His eyes found the general's, and in them was recognition, a mutual understanding that this moment was not spectacle, but closure. The general stopped at the doorway, lifting the flag with reverence. "This," he said, his voice steady, "is presented on behalf of those who cannot be here, for the men who lived because of you, and for the ones who did not, for the ones you carried, and for the ones you refused to abandon." Michael's hand tightened slightly at his side. He stepped forward and accepted the folded flag with both hands, holding it against his chest. His expression barely changed, but the smallest flicker crossed his face, like a crack in stone that revealed the heat beneath. The general lowered his voice. "You deserved this long ago, but since you would never come to accept it, we had to bring it to you." There was no applause, no cheer. The weight of the gesture was too sacred for noise. The neighbors watched in reverent silence, some with tears in their eyes, others with heads bowed as if in church. Michael held the flag for a long moment, then nodded once. "Thank you," he said quietly. The general straightened, offering a final salute. Michael returned it with equal precision, the motion as sharp as it had been decades earlier. When the salute ended, the general placed a hand briefly on Michael's shoulder, a gesture not of command but of brotherhood, before turning and walking back to his car. The vehicle pulled away, leaving the block hushed and still. Michael stood alone in the doorway, the folded flag resting against him like a second heartbeat. After a while, he stepped back inside the store. The flag was placed gently in the glass case where he kept old photographs and trinkets too meaningful to sell. He did not display it as a trophy, but as a reminder, tucked beside the metal that had always remained half hidden. Later that afternoon, the young mother returned, her children in tow. She carried another bag of groceries, but this time she pressed it across the counter toward him. Inside were fresh bread, apples, and a carton of milk, the same items he had once slipped into her hands. "You gave to me," she said softly. "Let me give back." Michael glanced at the bag, then at her. He shook his head once gently. "I'll take the smile," he said. "That's enough." Her children, emboldened now, leaned across the counter to hug him. The boy whispered, "You're our hero." Michael patted his shoulder, answering only with a quiet hum of acknowledgement. The act of kindness that had sparked outrage was repeated now in reverse, and this time it was not mocked. It was honored. As evening settled in, Michael slipped an extra loaf of bread and a small packet of cookies into the bag of another struggling family. He did it quietly, the same way he always had, with no speech, no flourish. Some noticed, some did not, but for him, nothing had changed. This had always been his way. Outside, the neighborhood had begun to breathe easier. The shame of their earlier judgments lingered, but it had been softened by the opportunity to repair, to live differently. People spoke to one another again, smiled when they passed, and greeted Michael with respect rather than suspicion. The street itself seemed to stand taller. As night fell, Michael sat once more at a small table above the laundromat. The folded flag rested near him, its edges sharp and perfect, its weight heavy with memory. He placed one hand over it, then over the metal in his pocket. He thought of faces, some alive, some long gone, of voices in the dust, of promises whispered in chaos. And he thought of apples, milk, and cookies, of small kindnesses that mattered just as much as the great ones. When he closed his eyes, he did not hear the jeers of the internet or the mutters of neighbors. He heard the steady rhythm of boots on pavement, the laughter of children walking home fed, the quiet thank you of a mother whose dignity had been spared. For Michael, that was enough. Recognition would fade, outrage would fade, but compassion would endure, as long as one person chose not to turn away. On that street, in that store, amid cans of beans and cartons of eggs, a truth had been revealed. Not every hero stands on a stage. Some stand behind counters, slipping food into a bag without asking for anything in return. The block would never look at him the same way again. And yet, for Michael, everything remained as it had always been. Service without applause, duty without reward, kindness not as charity, but as a code. The story had begun with shame. It ended with silence. The good kind, the kind born from respect too deep for words. And as the final customers left that night, Michael stood once more in the doorway, the bell above the shop tinkling softly. The street glowed beneath lamplight, children's laughter echoing faintly in the distance. He exhaled, steady, as if releasing years of weight in one long breath. The flag remained inside, the metal still close to his chest, and the truth, his truth, woven into the fabric of a neighborhood forever changed. Because sometimes the loudest lesson is not shouted, not posted, not recorded. It is lived, quietly, daily, faithfully. And sometimes that is enough. What this story leaves behind is simple yet profound. Compassion is never weakness. Kindness is never wasted. And those who live by a quiet code often carry the heaviest truths. We never know who walks beside us, who rings up our groceries, who nods silently on the street. Sometimes the greatest strength hides in the most ordinary places. If this story moved you, stay with us. There are more journeys worth hearing, more lessons worth carrying. Remember to like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and follow along for the stories still waiting to be told. Your voice matters, your presence matters, and together we keep these truths alive.